Quiero contarle, mi hermano, un pedacito de la historia negra, de la historia nuestra, caballero. Y dice así. Dice.
Latina means that I'm part of a larger group of people that are of Mexico or Central and South America, including, obviously even Puerto Rico, right? And Dominican Republic or whatever. So for me, the term Latina means that we're a part of a larger group of people that come from these regions, right? And that also means that within that there's a variation of how we define ourselves and who we are as a people. And that's probably the closest thing that we can potentially use to define ourselves, right? But within that term, it's also, difficult because then people's assumption is that we're all the same, when in reality we're not. Sure, if I'm in a group with Latinos, I'll be like, I'm Latina. And they're like, oh, you're Latina? Sure, whatever, But then when I'm with all these Latinos, it's like, no, but I'm Mexican, and I define myself as such. For me, the term Latina just means, it is in some ways empowering because it does bring people together, either for a common cause or saying we're together and united. But I also think it devalues in some ways the essence of each individual, either country or our own cultures. So, at the end, it's sort of how you define yourself. And I think, for the most part, you ask any Latino, like, yeah, sure, we're Latinos, but then you'll break it down and like, no, but I'm Puerto Rican, no, I'm Dominican, but I'm Cuban. Because we realize that even amongst us, there's such a difference in terms of who we are. And then they get to middle bit and they're like, oh, well, what are you guys, what's this, what's a tortilla, and how do you, warm it up? Or, so, for me, it was sort of having not only to teach other Latinos about what it meant to be a Mexican from East LA, right, and our history and so forth and so on, right? But that also meant that I now became part of a larger group of people, and through that I was able to learn so much about food and music and become more politically conscious in terms of our connection to other parts of the world, that I had never really thought about, And being in Middlebury, and even in my class, or the class after me as well, you had people that were from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. We had people who were Cubanos, so that was my first time getting the opportunity to meet other quote-unquote Latinos, right? Mm-hmm. But even back then, when I got to Middlebury in 1989, there was sort of this notion of, oh, you guys are all Hispanic. Young and being in Middlebury and no one ever teaching me that I would have to encounter so much diversity. And when I say diversity, it's not just, your typical white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kids, right? But mm-hmm. It was more that diversity in terms of other, Latinos and African Americans and Africans and Caribbeans and Asians, that I had never been exposed to because my neighborhood was strictly Mexican, and yeah, you had your, your little pocket, maybe that one Asian kid in your class or maybe that one black kid, in your school, but that was it in terms of diversity. And so going to Middlebury shaped me in terms of the world in many different settings, not only based on socioeconomic status or, gender identity or, sexual orientation, but also in terms of how others perceived me and who I was, and questioning potentially what my identity was, but at the same time making me even stronger and more conscious to love myself and to feel like I come from, a people that is, that I should be proud of, I guess, you know what I mean? And not that I wasn't proud before, but it just gave me the identity well, not even the yearning to find out more about who I was. Then you had Latinos who were like international students. So there was obviously a difference in terms of Latinos that were born or raised in America versus Latinos who were from Latin America. And you realize that there was such a difference in terms of, socioeconomic status, acculturation, sort of political conscience, and activism and advocacy sort of work on campus. So there was obviously differences in terms of who was getting involved in political activism on campus and who wasn't, right? Who was protesting and doing that work. I was one of a few students who actually sat outside of Old Chapel, because that's when we were fighting affirmative action. And, we had to sit out for I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 days. And we were even thinking, okay, maybe a hunger strike is next. Protesting the fact that, at that time it was sort of affirmative action, but more so it's more like we wanted, what we called it, the bicultural center,
Okay.
And so we were talking about having, African American Latino studies as majors. We were talking about recruiting other faculty and staff of color, addressing, racial, profiling on campus. I mean, so it's the same issues that obviously you guys are encountering, so it's the same, but yet we were radical. We were like, okay, well, we're taking this, we're doing a protest, we had t-shirts made, everybody's like, fear of Black House. I mean, it got real political. When we got to Middlebury, there wasn't a Latino group. I mean, we would have little hangouts. There was sort of let me face it. There was a group called, oh my God, what is the name of it? It started as Hispanic Alliance or something like that, but it used the term Hispanic, right? And it had, there was already this sort of conversations that we wanted something for Latinos, but nothing had been sort of set in stone. So Latinos were actually, in terms of students of color, I would say that the population was beginning to grow, right? So they, assuming myself along with, other Latino students, right? They felt like, wow, we need something that, is for us, right? Because a lot of us were members of AAA, and what we call it AAA. But before that, it was Black Student Union, and then it went into AAA, and I know that now it's Black Student Union again. But a lot of us were members of Black Student Union. We thought that this was the closest thing to a group that defined our needs, that addressed some of our concerns in terms of being students of color. But we also felt that we needed something more that spoke to our needs in terms of being Latinos and our own particular issues, that we felt dear to our hearts. But we also felt that we wanted to bring more issues in terms of, political consciousness to the campus, and through that we obviously formed Alianza, and we got together. We said, okay, well, we're forming this group. We went to student union. We said we want to, organize this group, blah blah blah, whatever. And that's where sort of Alianza was born. And I was elected their first president, I guess, of Alianza. Alianza sort of still has that their mission, in terms of being sort of a political arm on campus, to address issues that are affecting, Latinos on campus, and through that, building strong, connections with other groups on campus that might be facing similar situations.
Being Latina mean to me? It means speaking truth to power at this point, which it didn't, of course, when I was little, as I just said. But as I've grown up, I've realized there's a whole bunch of prejudice and stuff holding Latinos back, including me, and it's pretty much a constant struggle. So what does my Latina identity mean to me? It means going out there and pushing back against that. It means embracing my Latina identity and being really proud of my Latina identity and pushing back against oppression. Growing up, I was actually conditioned by my parents to not claim my Latina identity. when they were young children in school speaking Spanish, they were made fun of quite a lot. And so they actually really encouraged me and my sister and my brothers to embrace our American identity. So it was very much about being American and speaking English, not about being Latino and speaking Spanish. And so they actually tried very hard to keep us from speaking Spanish when we were little, even though they were speaking Spanish and my grandparents were speaking Spanish, so we were not allowed to speak Spanish. And so how has my experience shaped my Latina identity is an interesting question, because it's almost forced me to reject it as a young person. But then, of course, as I got older and started taking Spanish classes and learning more about my heritage that I had not really been able to learn in interesting ways as a Latina kid, I got really into being Latina. And found it was really interesting, like, oh my gosh, I'm Latina! I make tamales at Christmas time and do all of these things that are very, very, very much Mexican American or Latino. And I didn't quite realize that that's what I was doing. So it was a really interesting experience having this hybrid Mexican American identity, sort of straddling two things at once while not acknowledging one. So when I got older and learned to speak Spanish really properly, instead of just sort of as I'd been hearing pieces here and there growing up, I got really into it, and I traveled to Mexico, and I learned much more about Mexican culture and realized I was so super Mexican in ways that I never realized. So it's interesting to think about how my experience in my community has shaped it, because in some ways it's not shaped it. It's sort of pushed back against it. But then growing up and realizing that that was a really important part of who I was, even though it wasn't totally acknowledged, was also really fundamental for me as a student at Middlebury. I was still coming from, it was relatively new to be embracing my Latina identity. And I was still coming from that history of pushing it away. So it was an interesting moment. There were not a lot of Latino students. There were some. Alianza did exist, for example. There was a small community of Latino students. But as I struggled to do well here, I decided that the best thing for me to do was not segregate myself into a smaller community of Latinos, but rather just embrace what I had and do the best that I could to get the best education. So I don't want to say I put blinders on, but it was very focused. My tunnel vision, like degree, get degree, do what you can to get degree. So that was my sort of mantra. And I didn't really engage in a lot of identity politics when I was here. I just pushed through to get the coursework done. That said, I confronted my identity regularly in the classroom and found that my professors were not supporting me in ways that I think that they should have, now that I'm actually a professor myself. So for example, once when I was in school, in class during J-term, we were talking about affirmative action. I took a constitutional law history class with a guest professor who came from New York. And we were discussing affirmative action, and I had a comment, and someone said to me, well, you're only here because of affirmative action. And at the same time that I was sort of not engaging with my identity, I stood up in that classroom and basically schooled that person and explained that just because I'm a Latina doesn't mean that I'm not very qualified to be at Middlebury College. And so that was the kind of thing that I confronted pretty regularly in the classroom, with no support from professors, or very little, I should say. I shouldn't say no support, because that may not be an accurate statement, but definitely not in that moment. So it was really interesting to be a Latina at Middlebury in the early 2000s, because there wasn't a lot of us, and that was a moment. I feel like the generations are changing, right? My parents are like, be quiet and do what you're told. I was sort of in the middle of be quiet and speak up. And I feel like the students here now are much more on the speak up end of that spectrum, which I think is very good, and it's important to see those changes. But I was sort of in the middle of that, so it was interesting to struggle through when to be quiet and when to speak up. Teaching at Middlebury has been very interesting because, as I said, there's this sort of transition, right? You see change over time. I'm a historian, I think about change over time, right? So my parents' generation, be quiet, do what you're told. My generation sort of in the middle of be quiet and speak up at particular moments. And the current generation of Latinos at Middlebury, much more vocal than I was. And again, I think that's very important. There's also many more Latino students, even though, of course, there's still a huge minority at Middlebury College. And so as a faculty member, once again, I think I was pushed even more into the embracing my Latina identity and showing my students that it was okay, because I actually really regret that I didn't feel like I could express myself as a Latina. I could be a Texan, I could be working class, but I never felt like I could really be Latina here. And I think it's really important that my students feel that they can be. I think Middlebury has a lot of potential to do a lot more for all of our students. And I actually, as a Latina faculty member, really wanted to take on that education piece for not only my Latino students so they could see someone in the classroom that looked like them and taught about things that mattered to them, but also I wanted to teach all of the white students and all of the other students about what it means to be Latino and what it has historically meant, because they need to learn that too, and it shouldn't be on our students to teach that kind of thing here. It was really hard to be a Latina at Middlebury in 2002 to 2006. It's still really hard, and it's really hard to be a Latina faculty member here. That is really important for people to hear. I have never felt more invisible in my life than when I was teaching at Middlebury, even more than when I was a student.
It means having a sense of joy and pride in who I am and where I come from, and what that means for me as an individual and the interactions that I have on a daily basis.
All of these cultural factors that sort of shape your idea of how you relate to people, from music, food, to sports, to like I don't know. I guess it's a range of cultural elements that make you closer to people. It's a certain warmth. It's a certain like openness to I don't know. I feel like in general I just think of Latinos as a lot more open and warm. There's also like a connection over a struggle that a lot of either all Latin American countries have very different contexts, but I think there's a collective feeling that writers have written about of all the process of like decolonization and what it means for people to connect over struggles that are not exactly the same but like have a lot in common. So I think there's also a social consciousness element that connects Latinos, even though like very, very different in different countries.
Latinx, to me, means being a fighter and being unapologetic, being brave, courageous, and proud of who you are, of where you come from, of all your struggle, not necessarily seeing the good with the bad, right?
Being Latino means being first and foremost not white, and what it means outside of that is sort of paper thin. It does mean that I have this sudden sort of affection for anybody else who's from a Spanish-speaking country, because of, I don't know, maybe some background beliefs that, maybe their mom is like my mom, maybe they went through some shit I went through or something like that.
I think there are two parts to this. There are little things about being Latina, and that's being at home and speaking Spanish with my parents, or greeting my family members and giving them a kiss on the cheek when they leave and when they come in through the door, or it's sitting at a dinner table with 11 people and eating a home cooked meal. But I think there's a larger or greater idea to being Latina, and I think family is very central to my Mexican culture, and I think that's the larger aspect of being Latina.
I think since I've traveled to other parts of Latin America, I've learned that it's just a weird term that the U.S. has come up with to sort of group Latin Americans together. I also understand that it's weird because we're so different. Every single country is just so different. Our food is different. Words here and there are very different. Our accents are different. So it's useful, but then also not useful to have a term that groups all of us together and then also takes away a lot of our individuality.
I never thought of my Latino identity before I even left home, Nicaragua, because this idea of people being united with this like Latino identity it's something that only gets shaped once you leave a country in Latin America. So I didn't think of myself as a Latino growing up, but you know there was definitely a consolidation of like a national identity. I felt Nicaraguan, and when I left, that just sort of shifted to relating to other people from Latin America.
Having grown up in a very multicultural society where the majority of cultures were Latino, really has shaped who I am, and that I feel comfortable being half Colombian, half Cuban, and being okay with not identifying with one of the two specifically, and being part of that larger Latino community as a whole. And so kind of having that since the beginning of my life and the beginning of all my experiences has shaped who I am today, and then I feel really comfortable and really proud of my identity.
It's basically determined everything that's gone into what I see now as Latino, right? Not really like molcajetes or salsa or tortillas, but sort of like babies with slobber on them, you know, toys without batteries, you know, head lice. Yeah, I think that sort of thing.
I think a lot of what I consider to be Latina comes from just like hearing what my parents have to say about the Dominican Republic. So like I've never been there, unfortunately, but every time, like literally every time we have dinner, we're sitting around the table and they're talking about like what it was like to grow plátanos and like get avocados from the tree and like the cibao and all of these other stories. So I always like imagine myself there, but I haven't actually been there, so I don't know what that experience is like. And I think something that's different from my experience as being Latina at home, like East Harlem and then being in a school there versus like being at Middlebury now, is that it was sort of like self-explanatory. Like if people asked you where you were from, it wasn't necessarily a like alienating experience. It was more of like we all know that none of us, or at least our parents, aren't from like the United States, so like actually where are you from? And you wouldn't have to like explain, like if you spoke about plátanos or mangú, people would know. Like they just had more of an understanding about other people's cultures. So I think that community definitely helped me grow into what I think a Latina is today.
I've lost, I guess, my Latino identity through time, but it also just changes. It changes into something new, something. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't consider myself like a Latino living in the United States as other people who live in cities and stuff, because Middlebury is such a different context. But I guess I'm slowly transitioning there with the fact that maybe I'll live here the next year. That's different as being an international student, right? That's like a Latino in the United States. My
identity as a Latino, no, I think it's changed in negative and positive ways, right? Like negative in that, you know, the more I learn about Mexican Americans and the stuff that they're going through, you know, the more bad news I hear. You know, you don't usually hear good things. I've learned some cool stuff, right? Met some like undocumented kids that go to Ivy League schools and inspirational people like that. But as far as it, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's mostly negative, but I mean, there have been some positive things, you know, like sort of, I think I'm a lot more motivated as a Latino. I think that, you know, I think I've gotten better at channeling, you know, my enthusiasm as, you know, a relatively successful Latino.
I do recognize now that like I'm definitely, even if like it's uncomfortable and I don't want to be, like I'm American, I was born here, but I'm also inherently Dominican, so I just have to grapple with those two things.
Overall at Middlebury, it has been that like slow process of it becoming a smaller part of what you do every day. You know, I speak Spanish maybe like once a week or when I call my parents. So I think at Middlebury particularly, which is ironic because it's like the place where like, you know, all the diversity of cultures, but I think everything slowly like just mushes you into fitting a certain culture, a certain like Americanness that like you need to have, or you think, oh, I need to put that on in order to survive. Maybe that's like completely not true, but I think it's like a really subconscious like, oh, like am I speaking with an accent right now? Sort of all these like internal, very subtle processes, and so I think overall, yeah, maybe I've lost some of it. I don't know if you lose your identity. I think it just probably just changes.
I think it's been more of me showing other people what it means to me through the way that I act or the way that I identify. So it's not necessarily about how the Middlebury community has impacted me, but how I have brought my past experiences and my identity to the way that I behave and the way that I act here.
I think it's been really good. I think it's been really awesome. I think, I think I feel like an ambassador for my neighborhood, for my high school. And I think I can honestly say that the sort of stuff that I bring to discussions or that I bring to my papers really sort of tries to channel, you know, the sort of things that are happening to my community and to the people that I graduated with and what they're doing now. So yeah, being a Hispanic in Middlebury has been an honor. It's been, this Call of Duty, it's been good. It's been good.
I don't necessarily identify as a Latina. I see it more as like my identity as a woman and my identity as a Mexican American. Because I feel like a lot of the times those are the two categories that my experiences fall into.
I really feel like I haven't had to compromise any part of my identity while here at Middlebury. I feel pretty comfortable in myself and my identity as a Latina, so I haven't had to particularly like suppress that anytime.
I'm trying to think about like adding Afro-Latina to just the Latina because like I realize now that I'm definitely black, except I didn't grow up like knowing that I was black because Dominicans don't think of themselves as like a black people.
Now, like being on Middlebury or like on the campus, I think that I've definitely taken more pride in my identity, and I really associate myself with my Latina identity.
I think that I can't separate who I am from myself and my interactions with people at Middlebury, so it's something that I bring with me from, one-on-one interactions with people to larger scale conversations in classrooms, etc.
I feel like it impacts me in the classroom because in every class that I've taken here at Mid, I'm constantly aware of the fact that I'm either the only female or woman in the class, or that I'm a person of color in the class.
Where my Latino-ness comes out, right? Like, where I sort of pay the price for not being from this country or like not looking like these people. But I'm glad that's a part of my life. That's what like sort of charges conversations that I have with my dad. Like, yeah, I'm gonna go get it. I'm like studying hard. I'm the student that you think I am. I'll make you proud. That's a necessary part to like that whole narrative of like the struggle, So it's like it's a welcome part, Like on a weirder sort of note, I'm undocumented, and so that's been sort of an ingredient to like being Latino, right? And it's weird because since coming to Middlebury, like the uncertainty in the future has been a tremendously positive thing. It's like, wow, anything could happen, like these possibilities, and that simply was not true before. And being undocumented has been only a positive thing too. Like anything I say is that much more interesting because I'm undocumented.
Mi nombre es Giselle Hernández y yo soy latina.
Me llamo Cara, soy colombiana, cubana y americana.
Mi nombre es Jamie, yo soy afro-latina.
Me llamo Daniel Ramírez, vengo de Texas y soy mexicano.
Mi nombre es Andrés, soy de Nicaragua.
Me llamo María Mendoza y soy tejana como Selena.
Yo soy Angélica y yo soy Latinx.